Perfect. All right, welcome everyone. We're gonna go ahead and get started. There might still be a few people joining us as we're just at the top of the hour now, but that's okay. So welcome to today's webinar, Federal Policy on Mature and Old Growth Forests. I am Rhiley Allbee with the Forest Stewards Guild. I act as the Guild's Pacific Northwest Coordinator out of Seattle, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar in which we'll be hearing a presentation from the Forest Stewards Guild's Executive Director, Zander Evans. We do ask that during the webinar you stay on mute. You may enter any questions you might have into the chat and we'll try to address them all during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. This session is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel later this week. Additionally, throughout the presentation, we'll be dropping relevant links to documents or websites into the chat, and we'll also have all of those links listed in a follow-up email so that you can easily reference them later on. Next slide, please, Zander. So just to give you a quick run through of today's agenda, I'll be finishing up with my introduction and then we'll move into Zander's presentation, which will cover some background information on EO 14072, the definitions and inventory of mature and old growth forests that was released earlier this year, some information on the threat analysis, and then next steps in looking towards the future. Next slide, please. So some of you might not be familiar with the Forest Stewards Guild. So just to give you a little bit of background information, we are a national membership-based nonprofit organization, and we're focused on supporting forest stewardship through on-the-ground work, education, research, policy advocacy, and promoting professional practice. If you're not already a member, we do invite you to further explore our work and perhaps considering becoming a member in the future. Next slide, please, Zander. Oh, yeah, we can go to the next one also. I skipped that, sorry. So we would like to thank Mercer Salgar for sponsoring today's webinar through mitigation efforts that are related to the Forest Stewardship Council's Controlled Wood Standard. Thank you, Mercer Salgar. And with that, I will pass it over to Zander.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rhiley. And Rhiley gets all the credit for basically making this webinar happen. It's really good to have a team here. So I think a good place to start is the benefits of old growth. I think probably most of us are on this call because we love old growth, and it has a unique role in the ecosystem and our lives in general. And I just have a few bullets on this slide about some of the benefits of old growth. But I think we all know that from whether we're thinking about biodiversity, wildlife habitat, hydrology, it really has a unique role. And one of the ways we've seen that is around carbon. That's become more important as our emissions go out of control. And we know that old growth forests store tremendous amounts of carbon, but also, unlike what I learned in school years ago, the modern science is showing that they continue to sequester carbon at some fast rates. So they're important from that perspective. But I think for me, maybe this is sort of selfish, but I really value old growth forests just because I enjoy them, that the awe they inspire, the sort of spiritual connection with them. They're really important and irreplaceable in the way that, the Sistine Chapel is. And so I think that's a good place to start. I think that's probably a good commonality for folks on this call. But unfortunately, very quickly, once we start thinking about older forests, we start thinking about how rare they are and how much threat they're under. And there was a recent USDA Forest Service webinar, and I'm borrowing a number of their slides. This is one they shared on harvest from national forests over the last almost 100 years. And obviously you could go even farther back, but we as a society have cut a lot of our old growth forests, and in some cases built houses where they used to be, or chosen other land uses. So this is sort of the backdrop that our forests have changed dramatically. And so recognizing both the value of old growth forests and the change they've undergone, that's sort of where we enter into the current policy. And will, at least for me, the sort of current policy iterations is a good place to start is the Executive Order 14072. And that was on Earth Day last year from the Biden administration. And it called out for both USDA and DOI, Department of Interior, to define, inventory, identify threats towards, and develop policies to mitigate threats to mature and old growth forests. So, and I think Rhiley is working feverishly in the background to post some of these links. So if you want to follow up on the specific language, I feel free to go check that out. But for me, I think one of the key things when this came out was the inclusion of mature forests, because old growth forest has long been a kind of focus for the kind of ecological forestry I've been involved in. But linking it with mature forest was just a different approach. And I think we'll see throughout adds a new layer to some of these conversations. So these 4 bullets, define, inventory, identify threats, and develop policies, will kind of come back up, and we'll see the steps that have been taken thus far. And maybe this is a good time to recognize we have a lot of experts on this call. So although I'm the one speaking, I know that when we get to questions and answers, there's a lot of good knowledge just in the folks joining us today. In fact, at least a number of folks from USDA Forest Service registered. And so I think I don't want to presume too much. There may be folks who know more about all these elements than I do. And so hopefully my summary is a useful entree, but just acknowledging that I may not be the expert in the room here. So another, you'll see I'm borrowing a number of slides from a recent presentation of the Forest Service. And this one is useful because it highlights some of these policy pieces or mechanisms that lead to policy. And one of the reasons I like this slide is it starts to show the complexity. But really all these machinations are in service of trying to create national policy that helps conserve old growth forests. I think that's sort of at the heart of this, but there's a lot between here and there. So one of the first pieces of this puzzle was something called the Advance Notice for Proposed Rulemaking. And apologies in advance, but I'll probably refer to it as the ANPR. And this was a way for Forest Service, federal government in general, to start to engage the public and start to get some feedback on thinking about mature and old growth forests. And actually, one thing that I meant to say on that last slide that is worth saying now is what we're talking about here is federal policy. It's in the title of the webinar, et cetera. And federal policy often is maybe not explicitly, but influentially linked to policy on other land tenures. So I know some folks who work for state agencies are on the webinar today. And I think that works both ways. I think we'll talk about an example where some state policy may influence federal policy. And of course, it happens in the other direction as well. And so although rules for federal land tenure wouldn't apply to private land, et cetera, I think there's sort of a general community effort And so we may see influences of some of the things we talk about on federal land in other land tenures. So just trying to pull out that little nuance. But in this AMPR, Forest Service asked a lot of questions. And it was really, I was impressed by the breadth of the conversation and questions that the Forest Service opened up. And some were very broad questions, very important questions, like how the Forest Service can braid together indigenous knowledge and Western science to improve and strengthen our management practices and policies, particularly in relation to climate resilience. So that's a super important question. Also shows the breadth. When I was sort of looking to contribute on this, I thought I was going to get into like details on old growth, which it includes as well, but it's also some of these overarching questions. So I think that shows that this, yes, we're talking about old growth, but it's linked to a lot of other things. And I just have these are just a few of the numerous questions that were in the AMPR, just to kind of give you a sense of the breadth of it. And the Guild, as well as the Forest Stewards Guild, as well as many other organizations, submitted sort of formal comments. That's one, if you're not familiar with these federal processes, right? That's one way that an organization or an individual can make their voice heard. And so we'll share the Guild's comments, since this is a Guild-hosted webinar, but I know there are a lot of other organizations that submitted comments as well. And we tried to focus on comments that represented the expertise of our members, people working in the woods. But we also connected with our colleagues at the Wilderness Society and Center for American Progress and Silvex Resources. I'm going to forget a bunch, National Wildlife Federation, and sort of had some conversations about where we agreed on policy and ways of thinking. And one of the things that came out of that conversation was a model that I believe was developed or sort of fleshed out in Connecticut. It's not a super complicated model, but it's a useful way, I think, of breaking a large problem into smaller buckets or smaller pieces that are a little bit easier to get our hands around. So this idea that was echoed in some of the AMPR comments included the idea that, okay, there's some old growth forests that are healthy, doing well, and really, can just be let go. We can protect them from sort of inadvertent damage or something, but they don't need a lot of hands-on stewardship. Unfortunately, I think most old growth forests, probably because of long history of human intervention in the climate and our environment in general, need some stewardship to survive. And we'll talk about that in more detail, but some obvious examples are old growth forests that are threatened by uncharacteristic wildfire. Another obvious example would be old growth forests threatened by invasive species. I dedicated years of my life to working on sort of response to the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is removing a keystone tree, the eastern hemlock, from old forests, well, all forests, but old forests in across the East Coast, and has devastating impacts for old growth forests. And so that's a case where we humans are responsible for the existence in North America, the hemlock woolly adelgid. And so I think we bear some responsibility for trying to help hemlock trees survive it. So that I'm happy to talk hemlock woolly adelgid to exhaustion, but just an example where an old growth forest might be in a park or in a protected area, but still may need some stewardship. And I think we have that responsibility. Then we can kind of change gears to mature forests. And we'll talk about what exactly mature forest is in a second. But thinking just in general terms about these sort of three buckets. There may be mature forests that, again, exist in a park and are so protected in a land tenure sense and are healthy, and their ecosystem processes are in place. And so essentially, they don't need a lot of intervention. They can just kind of continue to grow old and eventually become old growth. That is wonderful. Unfortunately, the next category is likely larger, and those are mature forests where maybe we want them, as there's a sort of a policy decision or a land tenure decision that we want them to become old growth, but they're going to need our help. They're going to need some stewarding to get there. And this could include, obviously, again, we're talking about federal policy, but we work a lot with private landowners, and it's perfectly legitimate for a private landowner to say, "Oh, I have an older forest, and I'd like to see it someday, not in my lifetime, become old growth. What can I do to manage it in that direction?" And there are a lot of things we can do, whether it's removing invasives, reducing the threat of wildfire, or just helping old forest characteristics develop. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Then the last bucket, obviously, we still all use a lot of wood products. And so there are going to be forests where either because of law, policy, or societal decision, we're going to harvest timber. And there are obviously many other reasons why we would not have a mature forest continue on ad infinitum into old growth. There are places where young forest is not as common, and for habitat and other reasons, we want to promote those conditions. So this was one way of sort of taking a very large problem of what do we do about old growth and mature forests, and starting to break it down into more, at least for me, more manageable buckets. So you can read a little bit more detail about that in some of the AMPR comments, like Rhiley posted in the chat window. So then, while this was going on, there was a team of Forest Service folks working feverishly on the identification, definition, and inventory of mature and old growth forests. And I have to say, this is very impressive work. In an incredibly short time, about a year, I think, they were able to turn this around. And science is an iterative process. There may be things that eventually change, but the ability to produce this in such a short time sort of reinvigorated my hope for all the things that Forest Service can do in a short timeline. So again, I'm borrowing some slides from one of their recent presentations. And actually maybe this was cut directly from the document that again Rhiley has posted here. But what I wanted to hone in here on is the definition of mature. Definitions of old growth, relatively easy when you hone in on a particular ecosystem. We, as a collective, we've thought a lot about that, and we can argue about some of the details, and that's, I think, worthwhile. But the mature piece was really terra incognita, and needed some good thought around how do you define it, and both sort of from a philosophical level, but right here we're thinking about, well, if we need to map it, how can we define it with the data that we have? And so I think they did a good job of sort of identifying old growth and then building backwards to identify a segment of mature forests. And again, I think there's places for good scientific discussion about how to do that, and different data, and there'll be new data in the future that will maybe augment this, but this is an excellent start. And so I wanted to you can get all these numbers from that document, but I just wanted to put a few up on screen. So there almost, 33 million acres of old growth across Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service land tenure, about 18% of what they manage. And hopefully the pie chart makes sense where I've broken out young, both for the Forest Service and BLM, et cetera. one thing, I live in a pinon juniper ecosystem, and so I'd be tempted to pull out pinon juniper forests and think about them maybe a little bit differently than just sort of lumping them with all other forest types. And so I sort of adjusted some of these numbers. Well, what do the numbers look like if you take out the something like 9 million acres of pinon juniper old growth? Not all that different, but just another way to sort of slice through the data. And one of the reasons I kind of started thinking about this was, if you look at this largest bar, sorry, I should give a little orientation. It's probably very difficult to read, but along the bottom are forest types. And then we have the y-axis is acres, and the dark green part is old growth, blue is mature, purple is young forest. So this largest bar is pinon juniper. And I guess it highlights how much pinon juniper is out there on federal land. And I think pinon juniper is really a fascinating ecosystem. I love to be in it. And I think it deserves some extra conversation. Old growth in pinon juniper is not gonna have some of the same feelings for folks that say it would in another large category, this spruce, fir, spruce, mountain hemlock group. And I also worry that some large numbers from pinon juniper might be swamping out things like, there's a small bar here that's maple beech birch, another favorite place that I love to go. And it really, this graph, maybe a little small to read, but highlights that we really don't have enough old growth by any measure in maple beech birch. And so I certainly wouldn't want to exchange a lot of acres in pinon juniper for maple birch beech. So maybe the point here is that an acre of old growth is not equal across forest types. They're just different. They have different values. There's a lot of wonderful things about pinon juniper, and a lot of wonderful things about some of these other types. So just maybe an example of more to talk about, more to discuss as a community in some of this inventory data. The next piece, and hopefully I'm staying on time here, but a reminder that if you do have questions about or comments about any of this, please put it in the chat window, and we'll open it up as we get into questions and answers. The next piece was a threat analysis. And so this was the webinar that happened, I lose track of time, 2 weeks ago, maybe. And as a recording is available on the Forest Service website. And so again, I'd urge you, if this is a topic of excitement for you, delve in, listen to that webinar. It goes into a lot more detail than I'll cover here, but hopefully it's useful for those who don't have the time to just get a quick summary. And for me, one of the pieces that I really latched onto from the preliminary threat analysis, and I think the report is on its way out as soon as they possibly can, is that since 2000, these were the top 3 impacts for old growth forests. So I really focused on old growth forests, setting aside mature forests, because there's so much more mature forest. And to be blunt, I'm a little less worried about losing a couple acres here or there of mature forest to one of these threats, but there's so little old growth just in general. This is really disheartening. Nearly 700,000 acres of old growth forest, at least damaged, impacted by wildfire. I don't know, there's sort of an open question about whether it could still be called old growth. But wildfire, particularly, I sit in Santa Fe, New Mexico, so it is really abundantly clear sitting here where we can lose old ponderosa pine trees and stands to uncharacteristic wildfire. Well, those trees are really tolerant to the fire to which they're adapted, low severity, frequent fire. When we have uncharacteristic wildfires, rush through an area, we lose these beautiful old trees and old growth stands. And so I know personally some of those nearly 700,000 acres, and it's really sad. Similarly, insect and disease, this I think is where we would fit in some of these invasives that I worry a lot about. It's a smaller number, but again, pretty worrisome. And then obviously we can't ignore tree cutting. I think it's obviously a much smaller number, but there's more conversation about what exactly happened on those 10,000 acres and what went wrong, either from an ecological or implementation perspective, that those trees were cut. At least that's my view. It seems like, given how little old growth we have, there was probably some error somewhere along the line that leads to those being cut. But again, if thinking about focusing my time, wildfires into insect and disease are really a place to emphasize. And diving into that, again, these slides are taken from the summary PowerPoint that have from a couple weeks ago, but these, I think, pull out some, at least to me, the most salient details. Looking forward to the future, and this is the end of century map. So in 2100, I certainly won't be here, but I really hope the next generation has the forest to retreat to, as I have had. And thinking about these days over 90 degrees, there's a lot of areas that's going to experience that, much different than our first bar historical, right? Just looking at the change over time. And that is obviously inextricably connected to drought. And so there's some good science on just tree loss due to drought. Vapor pressure deficit in large areas, particularly the Southwest, is increasing at a rate where trees just die on the stump. They just cannot function given the temperatures and the lack of water. So this is no small thing, and really worrisome. Then those again contribute to our wildfire risk, and this is sort of a red alert map, in my view, of when we look at the end of century, very high risk or exposure, I guess is the proper term, to wildfire. Basically, it's everywhere except for a little bit in Wisconsin, Michigan, and the Northeast. That's unacceptable. We can't allow that kind of exposure to fire-related mortality for any forest, let alone our precious old growth. So this should be a very alarming map. And I'm not going to get into the detail of the depiction here. They're using fireshed maps because of other work they're doing at the Forest Service. To be honest, I don't think that's all that important. I think the visual is really sufficient, and you could use any set of pixels and essentially get to similar depiction. And there are opportunities for all of you to dive into some of these risks and start to think about areas you know and love, as well as sort of more broader national views, and think about what the risks are for particular places or how these risks combine. It's important to be able to get your hands into this data as we're all trying to understand this, and think as citizens we have some role in policy. So if we're going to speak up on policy, this is a good place to start to understand what some of these risks are. And that's my understanding, is that's why they built it in the first place. So just a couple of screenshots to know kind of what might be available to you if you dug into the GIS online. This is a map of mature and old growth, and they've used, I'll call your attention to this little 3x3 square. This is the way they're coding, at least visually, old growth and mature forests on this map. And They're using two colors, like a pink for mature and a blue for old growth. As they combine, it gets to that sort of dark blue purpley color for both a lot of old growth and a lot of mature forests. So it's just a way to get a lot of information across visually. And what you see is obviously more pink than blue. And that's, as we saw from the raw numbers earlier, there's just more mature forest out there than there is old growth. But this helps us hone in on where is old growth relative to other pressures. And this is focused, sort of built out from Forest Service lands. But there are other tools that we can start to think about across land tenures. So certainly just as is important on state and private lands. And I think one more, and we'll sort of change gears a little bit here. But this another piece of data that they include, another example of the data sets that you can look at, this is the at-risk terrestrial ecosystem. So NatureServe, another way to look at threats. And obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but red is bad here. The legend didn't come through the way I wanted, but we can hone in on places like this map, New Jersey, right? The Pine Barrens in New Jersey, a really amazing ecosystem. And I would agree with NatureServe here, highly at risk. Wildfire is actually a big one, but also development. A lot of it is outside of protected lands. So, this is just an example of another way to start thinking about some of these threats, how it interacts across a whole range of variables for old growth. And so we'll change gears here, but again, the threat analysis will be available soon. And I don't know if anybody who works for the Forest Service wants to add in a date. I don't think they quite have a release date yet, but I'm expecting it soon. And I think we'll sort of codify in book form or report form some of these data. And with that, we'll sort of change gears, maybe get a little bit more optimistic, thinking a little bit about solutions, and I'll turn it back over to Rhiley.
Thank you, Zander. So yeah, with that and looking at the threats that old growth is facing and potentially policy solutions looking into the future, we wanted to talk a little bit about mature and old growth forests in relation to the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, which is a little bit of a mouthful. So I will be saying CFLRP. So for those of you that aren't familiar, the U.S. Forest Service Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, or CFLRP, was established in 2009. And it's a popular policy initiative that encourages and supports science-based restoration projects. And these projects support local rural communities while also improving forest health through the collaboration of a spectrum of partners that often includes local businesses, tribal entities, and conservation organizations. And through this multi-partnership collaboration, they make consensus-based decisions on recommendations and actions for restoring and managing our forests. So with funding and guidance from the Wilderness Society, we wanted to look at how CFLRPs have addressed old growth and mature forests. And to do this, we reviewed information that has been publicly uploaded to the U.S. Forest Service CFLRP webpage, which included information from 31 funded CFLRP programs and 44 unselected CFLRP proposals, which in total was 75 projects. So this covered 387 documents, which range from annual reports to monitoring reports, proposals, work plans, extension proposals, etc. It was a lot. In each document, we looked for a selection of terms that related to mature and old growth forests and then extracted the context of each of those, around each of those terms that were mentioned. And from that, we found that 90% of all submitted CFLRP proposals and 100% of all of the selected and funded CFLRPs addressed mature and old growth forests to some extent. And this includes around 50% of work plans and treatment plans, as well as 28% of cited goals and objectives. And additionally, themes that we saw most commonly associated with mature and old growth forest restoration and management included the management of wildfire and wildlife. So this is really encouraging that all of these CFLRPs are addressing mature and old growth forests. And also, while we do see a broad zone of agreement on the restoration and management of mature and old growth forests within these documents that we reviewed, it's also important to highlight that this is not the full picture. We only looked at documents that were publicly available on the U.S. Forest Service website. But in many cases, CFLRPs are doing even more than what we were able to glean from these documents. So, for example, the Zuni Mountains Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Project and the Four Forest Restoration Initiative, as well as the Tapash Sustainable Forest Collaborative, just to name a few, have all developed and published separate strategies for managing mature and old growth forests. And I'm sure that other CFLRPs are doing the same, and we just haven't found those documents yet. So to get even a better picture of CFLRP's efforts with mature and old growth forests, we would need to do further research with each individual CFLRP. But like I said, it's very encouraging to see that all that they've been doing already. And so as we're looking at these upcoming policy decisions regarding old growth and mature forests, we just want to highlight the work that CFLRPs are already doing, and also perhaps suggest looking further into their work for pathways forward on how to manage mature and old growth forests through collaborative processes. And I will leave you with that and hand it back to Zander.
Yeah, thanks, Rhiley. And Rhiley deserves a lot of credit for getting and going through those nearly 400 documents, because I think it does highlight the locally focused. One of the great things about CFLR is it brings together folks in a local landscape who really know the area and have care about that area to think about all the values, and as Rhiley highlighted, old growth being one of them, and how to perpetuate that. So other sort of trying to be more positive, thinking about solutions, I want to point you to the Guild's YouTube channel, where a number of webinars with folks smarter than me are archived, but there's some great, you can see the titles here, focusing on management for old forest characteristics. This obviously is inappropriate everywhere. You're not going to do this kind of work in a national park, but there are lots of places where Guild members work where the landowner, land tenure sort of has a stewardship mission and is focused on growing or perpetuating old growth. And so personally, I just find this kind of work fascinating. I think it's really some of the cutting edge work in our field of forestry and conservation. So feel free to check those out. And I think from the Guild's perspective, as we think about how we can contribute to this effort, I think this is one place. And not to just even on the sort of chat as we were getting ready for this call, there was another Guild member on talking about variable retention thinning and how that might work in new areas. And so I think it's a really active place for learning and trying in the field. So I'm excited about that. And then there are going to be more opportunities to engage. So I'm not as good on the details of where these policy elements have public comments, but my understanding is that I think there'll be a public comment connected with the threat assessment, and as the Forest Service and Department of Interior move towards promulgating some sort of policy as called for by the executive order where we started all this, there are going to be more opportunities for either submitting public comments or engaging with our federal partners particularly. And again, from a Forest Stewards Guild perspective, the Guild feels like we have something to add here. And so we'll be engaging with our members to submit sort of organizational comments and thinking how best to help. And so with that, I think we can move on to questions, comments, and I see at least one good one coming in from Cheryl. So I encourage other folks to chime in here. And I'll maybe jump the gun here, but dive into, Cheryl, your comment. So to be blunt, I have not been tracking BLM's effort as closely. But back to the point about Pinon Juniper, I care a lot about ecosystems that Bureau of Land Management manages. So to the extent we have bandwidth, we will try to engage on that effort as well. I think there's a lot of good work. A lot of good work that needs to be done. And I'm not sure Guild is a small organization, how much we'll engage, but I encourage, particularly, I think there's often on Bureau of Land Management lands, there's a rangeland interaction. And so I may goad some of our partners like K-Vera Coalition to get more engaged on some of that work as well. Spread the workload, right? Other questions and comments? I think we've got some good time available to us. And if you'd like to unmute, I think we can handle that, right, Rhiley?
Yeah, I think we have a small enough that it'll be okay if you guys feel comfortable unmuting and asking any questions or any comments.
And just be forewarned, I recognize some of these names, so I may call on you and ask you your opinions. Yeah, I see Cheryl's comment about the majority of the old growth forest managed by Bureau of Land Management are Pinon Juniper woodlands. Not surprising. Amber, do you want to unmute? And Dana has a question. Amber, you saved by the bell there. Dana, please.
Amber can get called on after me. And forgive me if my question isn't super well articulated, but CFLRPs operate within it's a national program like Rhiley described, and they're also operating within the confines and some of the restrictions associated with specific forest plans, as well as because often they're all lands projects. Sometimes they're interacting with state forest action plans and other types of direction. And so I'm curious to know, CFLRP is one strategy and one program to move forward, collaborative landscape restoration. And so within the confines of those other things, when you're thinking about within a forest plan that was last updated 20 years ago or 15 years ago, where you have certain MA5 timber zones or other targets that you're trying to meet, did the research or the review that you all took on point to any way to communicate clearly about those things and to find areas of compromise?
Well, I knew early on in this webinar, I mentioned that there were people who knew more than I who were joining on, and here is an example. So that's a great question, Dana. And I will say something here, but my guess is you probably know more about this than I do. So my take on that is that, and maybe just to restate some things you said, CFLRP does not relieve a forest or a region of other overlapping responsibilities or commitments through forest plans, etc. So that is what it is. I guess based on people more versed in policy than my take is that there are opportunities through new policy development to get at some of those problems. And I don't know the right mechanisms, but I think that there are people, sort of in Forest Service office pulling their hair out thinking about, well, what policy options are available to respond to this old growth need, and within the kind of policy constraints of even the National Forest Management Act, but certainly forest plans, can we do things that essentially go through the proper process, but also alleviate maybe the requirements for whatever the timber management zones, as you gave a good example of. Does that get towards your question, Dana?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, it's a complex question. I put you on the spot a little bit, but just thinking through the different ways that the timing is kind of funny around, when different requirements have been put in place and when different opportunities for public comment and engagement have occurred compared to when a CFLRP might be awarded, for example. And so thinking through the way that different policy interactions can support collaborative forest management discussions actually on the ground and at the community level, and vice versa, how those things can then go back and inform policy within the lens of mature and old growth forests or any other one, I think is just something interesting to think about.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. One analogy I think of is a boat in the water with barnacles slowly collecting, right? Like our sort of forest management policy has just collected a lot of overlapping constraints over the years, and it may not entirely serve us.
Yeah, thank you, Dana. And I think that maybe that's like a spot for future research, because it's not an area that we looked into, but it is an important facet that does need to be researched and addressed. So to move forward, we do have another question, Zander. The USFS produced their MOG inventory, but there were also 2 other inventories that other groups produced. Can you share a little on the relationship between the various approaches used across these, and or the similarities or discrepancies between their results?
So another example where I think Blake knows probably more about the details than his question is admitting to, and I'll just be blunt. I have not dived into the nuances of the other studies. I know the Wilderness Society's Dr. Greg Aplett, and I'm forgetting his co-authors, but I have a lot of respect for their work, and I think it is worth delving into both in particular areas, why one inventory might have indicated that one area was mature or old growth and another inventory not, but then also looking at some of their larger numbers. So I guess I'm just going to try to sidestep your question, Blake, but I think that there is, and I don't know if there's anybody on who will have the official word on this, but I know that the Society of American Foresters, in conjunction with the Forest Service, is starting to think about putting together a science summit to really drill down with a good cadre of researchers into these questions, because as we all know, you can pull out some data and look at it one way, but another analysis can show very different information, and even with the best intentions. So Cheryl's saying this spring, so that's good. So I do think that we need to spend more time with the inventory data. And my instinct is the folks who worked on the Forest Service efforts would be the first to say that, yes, more mines are good, more time and discussion about methodologies and approaches to this are very important. And I hope people will add more questions, but until those start to pop up, I will add one other thing, and that is that I think there are a number of inventories or mapping estimates that would be useful in this conversation, all of which are very difficult. One map that I'd love to have a little more information on or confidence in is, what did pre-settlement old growth look like in the United States? I don't think we have a particularly good grasp of that. And that could drive some of our understandings of what current inventories mean. And then there's even a future issue that sort of hinted at by some of the maps that I showed from the Forest Service. Where is old growth viable? And where are, say, drought and temperature just going to make it unable to grow trees? And so all these pieces of the puzzle, I think, need more work. So not a very satisfying answer, Blake, but maybe I was sort of hoping somebody else would weigh in and save me there, but other questions or comments? Okay, thanks, Blake. Bobbing and weaving. No, and it's an important question because I think I was sort of presenting the U.S. Forest Service inventory, but that's certainly not the only cut. Other folks who want to add in here? And just a reminder, if you got on late, we are recording this, and so we'll post it on our YouTube channel. So if you missed something, or if you got on late, or if you have a colleague who you feel might benefit from this, we'll have it available. And I think the Forest Stewards Guild is happy to host other events if there's discussions or something that would be useful. We want to be part of the solution here. So if there's a way we can be helpful, please do let us know, whether it's in your favorite area or on a nuance of federal policy.
Well, if we don't have any other questions, I think we'll wrap it up. So thank you, Zander, for your presentation today, and thank you all for attending. As Zander mentioned, we will have, this is recorded and we will be posting it on our YouTube channel for you to access later. And we will be sending out a follow-up email with all of the links that we shared in the chat later in the week. So, and once again, thank you to Mercer Salgar for sponsoring this webinar. And I think with that, we will close it up. Thank you all so very much.
Thanks, everybody.